Good morning, River Rocks Church. My name is Trent. I'll be in the scripture with this morning. We're going to be in Mark chapter 14, verses 47 through 50. So context before we get started. If you've heard previously, Pastor Jeff was going through, Jesus is currently in the garden. He is at the point where he's been through the prayer to the Father for the disciples, himself, and the world. Right now, what he's having happen is Judas just came with the Roman soldiers, laid a kiss on the cheek of Jesus so that he could identify Jesus to the Roman soldiers. And that's where we are now. So verse 47 says, "And one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus answered and said to them, 'Have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs to take me? I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled.' Then they all forsake him and fled." So what do we see in this moment? We see a few things. First and foremost, one of the disciples cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest. If we look back on our cross references, John 18:10 tells us that this was Peter. Peter takes a sword and he cuts out the ear of the high priest in an attempt to defend Jesus from the soldiers that are coming forth. The reality is that this does little to nothing, and Jesus actually restores the man, that Roman soldier, in other contexts and other places of Scripture. But what's the practical of this? We see that the sword, what Peter is doing in this moment is he in his own flesh is trying to defend Christ. What's the reality? Nothing comes from it. The reality is that in his own flesh, in our own flesh, we can't do anything to defend the name of Christ or to defend, in Peter's sake, the physicality of Christ. Only in the Spirit, by being used by God, can we really do any work for him. We know this because Peter's used mightily through the book of Acts to spread the gospel when he is filled with the Spirit, to be able to do a mighty work as a vessel of the Lord. In his own flesh, by taking the sword, he does nothing for Christ. Rather, if anything, he's just embarrassing himself. But we see later that Jesus is going to commentate. So we see Jesus in verse 48, he says, "Have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs to take me?" What do we see in this? We see that we actually have Jesus as a little taken aback, because as Jesus was teaching through the temple, there was a multitude of people that were rightly able to seize Jesus, and it was a lot of people that would have had hands on Christ. But in this moment, it was only a few soldiers. He says it is like a robber, that they're going to seize a robber, which is a petty crime, but according to Jesus, he's leading a revolt to the Roman army. That's part of the reason of the arrest. So you would imagine they would have a multitude of soldiers, but Jesus says, "Why so little? And why do you come with swords and clubs to take me?" We also see that Jesus says, "I was with you daily in the temple teaching. You did not seize me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled." Jesus here marveled at how small the army is to arrest him, yet he was in command. We understand that in that moment, in the snap of a finger, what could Christ have done? He could have obliterated every person that was there. He could have made sure that he had no one lay hands on him. He could have ensured that he walked out of that garden. Didn't even have to take the cross. But what did he do? He willingly submitted to the will of God to take the cup of wrath that was before him. And what did that mean? Allowing those soldiers to take him. It wasn't that the soldiers took Christ or that they took the life of Christ later on, but rather Jesus says, "I laid down my life. I give my life." It is a willingness to submit himself for mankind, and in this moment, for the soldiers in Scripture to fulfill what the prophecy has been, to fulfill what the Scriptures have said. Jesus went along with the arrest so that Scriptures may be fulfilled. We see the last verse in this section, verse 50 says, "Then they all forsake him and fled." Who is this in reference to? Is the disciples. We understand that in this moment, all the disciples ran for their own safety, to be able to run away to ensure they weren't arrested. And in this moment, they left Christ. They left the side of Christ. And we know that James or John and Peter, they look from afar to kind of understand what's happening. But the reality is that as Jesus took the cross, as Jesus went to have the cat of nine tails onto his back to go through the torment that he endured on the road of Calvary, his disciples were not near. They were away. And many times this can shock us. They were doing it for their own safety, yet Christ has been the one that's protected them the entirety of his ministry through everything, and they weren't present for him. Many times when we are pressed by certain things, pressed by Christ, we can deny him like Peter may have denied him, or we can run away from him like the disciples did. What I encourage you with today is that as the world puts pressure on us as believers, maybe we don't want to talk about Christ because of the looks we might get. We don't want to tell someone about Christ because it might taint our image. I encourage you, don't be like the disciples that run away from Christ. Be by his side. Be willing to say his name. Be willing to defend his honor in the sense of, don't be afraid of Christ. Don't be afraid to be able to talk to him or talk about him to other people. The disciples left the side of Christ, and as Christ took the cross, he was only left with John and a few women by his side. And what I plead with you today is be by the side of Christ. Look to him, look to the cross. Ensure that you can deny yourself, take up the cross, and follow him. Jesus said in Mark 14:27, all of you will be made to stumble because of me. What was the stumble? It was leaving his side. I plead with you today, don't stumble onto Christ by leaving his side. Rather, walk with him by taking up the cross and denying yourself. It's a hard task, but it's a task that we're required to make as followers of Christ. And I hope it encourages you as you go through this week. Follow him and hold on tightly.